Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're on quite a critical mission, actually. We want to give you the evidence-based shortcut, the fast track to managing stress and anxiety, especially in those high-pressure situations. We're focusing specifically on the university student experience and this really challenging thing called repetitive negative thinking, or RNT. Yep, so we've dug into a whole stack of research here. There's a big systematic review on mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, in universities, plus some really striking studies on other techniques, cognitive restructuring, acceptance and commitment therapy, that's ACT, and something called rumination-focused CBT. The goal, to pull out the absolute fastest, most effective knowledge we can find right now for you on emotional regulation and, well, building that cognitive resilience.
And it's so important we do that now. The sources we looked at really confirm it. University students, they've faced this unique, intense vulnerability to stress, which, often spirals into clinical anxiety, depression. It's a serious issue. But the really exciting thing we're finding is that these modern targeted approaches, they're showing real measurable success. It's not just about coping with symptoms. It's about reducing that genuine cognitive overload.
Okay, let's jump right into that MBSR blueprint then. You mentioned this big review, 34 high-quality studies looking at MBSR just for university students. So what did the numbers actually show? How effective is it? Well, the results are pretty impressive, statistically speaking. MBSR programs, they led to reductions of up to, I think it was 33% of perceived stress. And even more broadly, when students reported on their overall mental health, those issues dropped by about 40%. It's huge. Those aren't small changes.
No, not at all. And to really get why those gains are so big, you need to understand what traditional MBSR actually involves. It's not just, meditating casually for 5 minutes. It's typically this structured 8-week program, often looking at, say, 2.5 hours of guided group sessions each week. You're doing things like body scans, sitting meditation, and importantly, there's this mandate for daily formal practice at home. Plus, trying to weave mindfulness into just everyday life, informally.
Right, that sounds pretty rigorous. So during those 8 weeks, what's actually being trained? What mental muscle gets built that changes how the brain handles all that stress and information?
It ties in really neatly with some core psychological ideas, specifically cognitive load theory, CLT, and self-regulation theory, or SRT. Take CLT first. It's basically about how much information your working memory, which is limited, right, can actually juggle at one time without getting overwhelmed.
Okay. So that feeling when you're trying to read something complex and someone's talking nearby and your brain just shuts down, that's cognitive overload.
Exactly that. MBSR seems to directly boost your attentional control. It helps you filter out those intrusive thoughts that just steal your mental bandwidth. And the evidence backs this up. Studies showed MBSR folks got about a 20% boost in task efficiency. And, importantly, a 30% reduction in mind wandering. So you're literally tuning up your mental engine to run more smoothly. Then there's SRT, self-regulation theory. That connects more to emotional resilience. MBSR improves your ability to manage your stress response proactively, like before it gets out of hand. We saw, a 40% improvement in emotion regulation scores reported. And people also said they use adaptive coping strategies about 35% more often.
Okay, adaptive coping, like cognitive reappraisal. Can you give an example? Say a student really bombs a midterm. What's the difference in their head before and after MBSR?
Good question. Before, the thought might be catastrophic. I failed, I'm stupid, I'll never graduate, my life is over. Just total downward spiral. After MBSR training, that reappraisal skill lets them shift it. More like, okay, I did poorly on that test, and that feels bad, but it's one test. It doesn't define me or my future. Let me figure out why I did poorly. Maybe my study method wasn't right, and change that for next time. It becomes constructive, problem-solving focused.
Interesting. But you mentioned the outcomes weren't uniform across all students, right? It depended on their field of study.
That's right, yeah. Healthcare and psychology students, they saw the biggest jumps in mental health improvement, which kind of makes sense given the emotional demands of their fields. Business students showed measurable improvements in their decision-making skills. But STEM students, well, they did show gains in cognitive flexibility, but their participation rates were generally lower.
Lower engagement in STEM.
Fields known for being pretty rigid, logical. That sounds like a potential barrier to getting these techniques adopted, doesn't it? It does. It points to maybe a cultural mismatch sometimes. This a softer approach of mindfulness doesn't always slot perfectly into environments that really value highly structured logic-first thinking. So it suggests we need to think about how these techniques are presented, how they're packaged for different groups to really maximize their reach.
And the other big question, Digital delivery. We all want easy access. Apps are everywhere. Did the app-based MBSR versions hold up?
Well, psychologically, yes, the benefits were comparable. Stress reduction, anxiety reduction, those were still there with digital MBSR. But, and this is a big but, the dropout rates were significantly higher than in-person programs. It seems like that direct engagement, the instructor presence, the social accountability of being in a group, that's really critical for sticking with it long term, especially when it's challenging.
Right, accountability. That's the missing ingredient online, it seems. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. MBSR helps calm the general mental noise. But what if the noise isn't just random static? What if it's a specific engine driving the stress? Let's talk about repetitive negative thinking, RNT. What exactly is that?
RNT is really seen as a core mechanism in a lot of emotional disorders. It generally breaks down into two main types. There's worry, those repetitive thoughts about bad things that might happen in the future, things that are uncertain. What if I fail this class? What if I don't find a job?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's rumination, especially what they call brooding. That's more looking backward repetitively and passively, dwelling on why something bad happened or why you didn't achieve a goal. Why me? What did I do wrong? That kind of loop. And what's really interesting is how some therapies, like acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, reframe this. ACT research suggests that this kind of unhelpful worry and rumination isn't actually necessary processing. It's more like an experiential avoidance strategy. You're using the thinking itself to try and avoid feeling the raw, difficult emotions underneath, like fear or sadness or inadequacy.
Whoa, okay. So the thinking is the avoidance. But how do you stop that? Doesn't try not to think about something just make you think about it more? Isn't that just another kind of avoidance?
That's the paradox, exactly. Trying to suppress thoughts often backfires spectacularly. ACT explains that this avoidance, this mental churning, actually prolongs the negative feeling, and that internal distress then pushes you towards other avoidance behaviors, maybe distracting yourself constantly, drinking, isolating yourself. The RNT becomes this self-feeding loop.
So the goal isn't suppression, it's disruption, which brings us to this other approach, rumination-focused CBT, RFCBT. There was a trial with young people who'd experienced depression, and RFCBT really cut down their rumination levels, right? Tell us about how that works.
Yeah, the reduction was pretty substantial, about a 0.92 standard deviation drop, which is clinically significant. But the really fascinating part was looking at the brain scans. They found that this improvement in symptoms correlated with a decrease in cross-network connectivity, basically less unhelpful crosstalk between two key brain networks. So you've got the default mode network, the DMN. Think of that as your brain's internal narrator, the part that does self-reflection, mind-wandering, thinking about me. And then you have the cognitive control network, CCN. That's your executive function, the problem solver, the part that tries to stay focused and regulate things. In rumination, it's like the DMN hijacks the CCN. The self-focused story just takes over and drowns out any attempt at logical thinking or regulation. RFCBT seems to actively dial down that noisy connection. It suggests the therapy might actually be modifying the brain's structure or function, making that rumination less automatic, less intense.
That's a really powerful concept, actually changing the brain's wiring, essentially. Is there evidence it's more than just a temporary effect?
Well, the fact that the degree of clinical improvement lined up with the degree of change in that network connectivity is suggestive. It hints that maybe the treatment is helping establish a new, less sticky baseline interaction between these networks, making the brain physically less likely to fall back into that deep groove of automatic negative looping.
Okay, let's get really practical now. If someone listening wants techniques they can use right now to interrupt these negative thought patterns, where do we start? Cognitive restructuring, key R.
Exactly. CR is basically a toolkit of learned skills. It helps you catch, examine, and then change those unhelpful thought patterns, what psychologists call cognitive distortions. Things like catastrophizing, assuming the absolute worst will happen, or black and white thinking, where everything is either perfect or a total disaster. The very first step, the foundation, is self-monitoring. You have to become aware of the thought in the first place. Catch it. Notice what it is, and importantly, what triggered it, the context. Then, maybe the most powerful part, is questioning assumptions. This is like using the Socratic method on yourself. You have to really challenge the thought. Is this based on feelings or actual facts? What's the real evidence against this thought being true? Is there another way to look at this?
That sounds tough because those automatic thoughts can feel so incredibly true in the moment. If a student's brain screams, "I'm going to fail this presentation," well, how do they find evidence against that feeling?
They have to actively look for objective data. Like, okay, I felt nervous before every single presentation I've ever given, and I haven't actually failed one yet. That's historical evidence. Or, my feeling is fear, but the fact is I practiced this for 6 hours. I am prepared. Separating the emotion from the objective reality, the third technique builds on that. Gathering evidence. You literally, systematically list the facts for your negative belief and then the facts against it. It forces you to confront the bias. If your thought is, I'm a total failure, okay, write down 10 things, big or small, that you have succeeded at recently. Concrete proof. And finally, number 4 is generating alternatives. Once you've poked holes in the distortion, you consciously create a more balanced, rational explanation or plan. So instead of just, I'm terrible at math, the alternative might be, okay, maybe I need a different study strategy for math, or perhaps I need to practice relaxation techniques before exams. It shifts from a fixed label to an actionable solution.
That's a really solid practical set of tools. But you mentioned something earlier that sounded almost too good to be true ultra-brief therapy. Tell us about that one-session ACT protocol for RNT.
Right. This was a fascinating study design. Just one session, about maybe 75 minutes long, focused entirely on acceptance and commitment therapy principles applied to R&T. And the key was they didn't try to tackle every single worry. They helped the person identify and work with their single most powerful overarching negative belief, or trigger, the big one, you could call it. So if the core belief driving everything was, I'm a failure, that was the focus of the session.
Okay, but did one 75-minute session actually make a difference long-term? Or was it just like a temporary boost?
The results were actually quite remarkable. They found very large effect sizes, meaning a big impact on measures of R&T, that experiential avoidance we talked about, and cognitive fusion, which is like being tangled up with your thoughts. And crucially, these effects held up even 6 weeks later at follow-up. The idea is that by targeting that core trigger, that big one at the top of the worry hierarchy, the positive effects kind of cascaded down and disrupted all the smaller related worries too. It was efficient. So pulling all this together, what we're seeing is solid evidence that these approaches, MBSR, RFCBT, ACT, CR, they really work. They're not just about managing symptoms day to day. They seem to genuinely increase psychological resilience, improve cognitive function. It's almost like remodeling your internally emotional architecture.
Definitely powerful stuff. But we should also touch on the limitations mentioned in the research, right? Where do we need more information? A lot of these studies rely on self-reports, which can be subjective. And there's a definite need for more long-term data tracking people beyond 6 months to see if these benefits really stick. Plus, expanding studies across different cultures. And that digital dilemma again. Since sticking with purely digital MBSR seems tough for many, the future probably lies in hybrid models, doesn't it? Finding ways to combine the rigor and maybe the social connection of in-person training with the sheer accessibility and potential for personalization that digital tools offer. Which leads us nicely into our final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. If just one targeted ACT session can create such big, lasting ripples by focusing on that single big one R&T trigger, and if we know that adherence is tricky with purely digital longer programs like MBSR, then what specific ultra-focused R&T disruption techniques, maybe like that Socratic questioning from CR, or identifying your big one from ACT, should be strategically integrated into personalized, accessible, maybe hybrid mindfulness programs to give you the most efficient, impactful results? Something to think about.